of men when the Titanic was sinking, and many men sacrificed themselves to save the women and the children. And in a sense, that violates the purely biological impetus for self-preservation, let's say. But if it's serving a higher order ethical precept that is even more fundamentally related to survival across time, then maybe the contradiction could be ironed out.
I suppose in evolutionary terms, the logical thing would be, though, for the women and the children to go first on the Titanic.
Yeah, well, the men are more expendable, right? Because you need fewer men. If push comes to shove, you need fewer men.
But to go back to the Hebrew midwife, or the Hebrew or the Egyptian midwives, they're intuitively saying something against the highest power in their universe, the Pharaoh.
And to their own danger.
Well, exactly, which is quite extraordinary. You probably know the story of W.H. Jordan coming to faith. I mean, he was a self-professed left-wing atheist. And early in World War II, coming to take refuge in New York, he would follow the documentaries, weekly television, and one weekend he went in to see the documentary on the siege of Poland, Nazi stormtroopers bayoneting women and children. And it was in the Upper East Side, a lot of Germans, America hadn't declared war. The German audience cried out, kill them, egging on their own countrymen. America was neutral. And Auden sat there in 5 minutes. He says, I can't say this is absolutely wrong. There are no absolutes. That's old-fashioned whatevers believe that. But then he said, I had to say there was an absolute if this was absolutely wrong. And he said later, I left the cinema a seeker after an unconditional absolute and came to faith in God. The only basis for it.
There's something very deep about that too, because it could like one of the things I've come to realize about the symbol of the crucifix, and I'm just speaking psychologically here and not theologically, is that at the very least, what that symbol is it's the impetus among billions of people across 2,000 years to look at the worst thing they could imagine. And so there's an idea that you come to understanding of transcendent good most particularly through focusing your attention intently on what is undeniably tragic and malevolent. And that could be, I really think that's true psychologically, because one of the things I became convinced of studying the Holocaust atrocities and the Gulag atrocities in particular was the absolute reality of suffering and malevolence. And then you think, well, because it's pain, suffering, and cruelty, those are undeniable realities. That's the Auden experience. And they say, well, is there anything more real than pain, suffering, and cruelty? And the answer would be, yes, that which can transcend those three things. And it could easily be that you cannot make contact with what transcends those without diving deep into the nature of those as deep as possible. And I certainly see the biblical narrative focusing, for example, on the crucifixion, but not only that, as the collective attempt of mankind in some real sense to come to terms with the worst that life has to offer and to discover as a consequence something that transcends that. So,
well, do you know the story of Philip Halley? You know, the Jewish scholar who spent his life investigating the Nazi war crimes and all that. And one time he was so depressed by what he was studying, he was ready to commit suicide. And sitting in his study with this wealth of literature, picked up a little pamphlet he hadn't read before. And after about 5 minutes of reading, he thought there was a fly in it. It was a tear. His heart had been hardened, and he read the story of Le Chambon, the little Huguenot village that rescued 5,000 Jewish children. And he said it was heart-cracking goodness.
Right. Yeah,
and that was his intuitive.
The woman who wrote The Rape of Nanking, she committed suicide. Yeah. And no wonder. You know, you look at that sort of thing, and if you look at it deeply, it just tears you into pieces. And then the question is there anything that can put you back together? And that really is the question. And it's the question everybody faces in life in some real sense, right? Is how can you not be torn apart into despair and vengefulness by catastrophe and malevolence? And that is the question that faces everyone. So, all right, the midwives feared God and did not, as the king of Egypt commanded them. There's a lot wrapped up in that line, as it turns out, but saved the men, children alive. And the king of Egypt called for the midwives and said unto them, Why have you done this thing and saved the men children alive? And the midwives said unto Pharaoh, Because the Hebrew women are not as the Egyptian women, for they are lively and are delivered before the midwives come in unto them. Therefore God dealt well with the midwives. That's a very interesting line too, because, well, do you want the Pharaoh on your side or do you want God on your side? That's kind of the question. And the people multiplied and waxed very mighty. And so despite their persecution, they're doing fine. And it came to pass, because the midwives feared God, that he made them houses. And Pharaoh charged all his people, saying, so he's getting upset here, Every son that is born you shall cast into the river, and every daughter you shall save alive. So that's echoing that emasculation of the people of Israel here in the most fundamental sense. So that's Exodus 1. Exodus 2. And there went a man of the house of Levi and took to wife a daughter of Levi.
That's an important verse.
Okay, have at her.
And it is, my favorite part of writing the commentary over these years is to take these verses that seem like nothing and realize it's so important. These are the parents of the savior of the Jewish people, Moses, but there's nothing special about them. And that's what that verse says. A certain man of the house of Levi went and married a Levite woman. That's
So it's
it.
a lowly birth motif.
A lowly birth motif. He doesn't come from royalty or divine stock or anything. Just regular folks gave birth to Moses.
Right, just regular folks.
Just,
right.
just.
Oh yes, very nice, very nice. And the woman conceived and bare a son. And when she saw him, that he was a goodly child, she hid him 3 months. Remember, the Egyptians are going to kill the firstborn Israelite males. And when she could no longer hide him, she took for him an ark of bulrushes and daubed it with slime and with pitch, a little boat, and put the child therein, and she laid it in the flags by the river's brink.
Forgive me, the word for boat is the same as Noah's Ark.
Oh, yeah.
This is the saving of the world again.
Right. Okay. So that's interesting. So she makes a little structure,
Right.
which is what you do with children, is you build a structure around them.
But it's the word for the Noah's Ark.
Okay. Okay. And this is also the first indicator of what becomes a very profound symbolic motif in the Exodus story, because Moses is allied with water throughout the narrative, whereas the Pharaoh and Egypt are allied with stone. And stone seems permanent and immovable, but it's brittle and hard and lifeless. And Moses is continually represented as a master of water and transformation. And so this is the first time you see that. Water is
Moses' undoing. Mm-hmm. He hits the rock and says, I will get you water and not God, and doesn't get into Israel.
Right. Well, so I guess that's when he misuses his relationship with his power over water. And water is chaotic, right, from a symbolic perspective, and water is associated with what you immerse yourself in when you're baptized. And water is like the pre-cosmogonic chaos that exists at the beginning of time. And so for Moses to be a master of chaos and water is also to make him procedurally the antithesis of the tyrant, because the tyrant wants everything in stone and solid, and Moses is the antithesis of that.
And I think there's also one thing that happens is you have an extreme. You have, let's say, the Pharaoh, and then you have water. And what happens is, what Moses is going to be doing through the entire story is making that mediation between what is above and what is below. And now you have this little image of the ark as being a little microcosm, which is what you see in Genesis, little microcosm of the world that exist in this extreme, right? Because in the flood, what you have is a return to the beginning, where now it's heaven and earth, and there's nothing in between. Like both of them can't sustain life. There has to be a hierarchy of reality that gets pulled out of the water, and that's what Moses is going to do. He's going to go up the mountain and bring down the law, and that is going to create that structure, that mediation between. Because even in the text, we'll see later, like God is also. Just God and the people doesn't seem to work, because God is constantly wanting to consume them. And it's like, no, don't consume them. So we need to have this mediation where being lays itself out and kind of falls down into the world in a way that is appropriate.
One of the things Jung said, and this is sort of relevant if you consider psychedelic experiences as well, which can be far more than they than people can tolerate. Jung said part of the purpose of religious practice was to stop people from having religious experiences. And because he was very interested in experiences that were extreme enough to border on psychosis, for example, and that if you don't have those intermediary structures between you and the absolutely transcendent, which might be reality itself in the ethical and material sense, then that's just too much. And you do see that echoed in motifs like the burning bush, where God tells Moses later not to look at him directly, at best to look at his back, right? Because you just can't withstand that direct contact with something that exceeds your comprehension in every dimension simultaneously. No matter how good it is, no matter how complete it is, it's just too much for the mortal soul to bear. And his sister stood afar off to wit what would be done to him. And the daughter of Pharaoh, that's so interesting that he's rescued by the daughter of the Pharaoh, came down to wash herself at the river, and her maidens walked along by the river's side. And when she saw the ark among the flags, she sent her maid to fetch it. And when she opened it, she saw the child. And behold, the babe wept. And she had compassion on him and said, "This is one of the Hebrews' children." That's an interesting line from the Jungian perspective as well, because Jung would have regarded the anima, the animating principle, which is the feminine spirit, as part of that which is constantly antithetical to the stone-like patriarchal tyrant. And it's very interesting that it's the Pharaoh's own daughter who actually proves her compassion, her genuine compassion for a helpless infant. So genuine compassion, properly placed, constitutes part of the power that can be used against the tyrant.
And she's placed exactly in the same position as the midwives, where it's like, here's a Hebrew child, and now once again it's a woman who saves so it's like, you could say that's the role of the feminine, is to nurture, is to give potential, is to hold, is to do all these things in order for the person to find their independence.
Right.
And is there not something of a paradox here of, you say, the man from nowhere, the Parsifal figure in a way, and yet he's discovered by the Pharaoh's daughter. So you see this motif is replicated unbelievably commonly as, say, the motif of the orphan. You see this with the comic book character Superman, most particularly, because Superman has ordinary parents. I think he lands in Kansas, if I remember correctly. And so they're just ordinary farmers, but really his parents are divine, right? They're heavenly. And the Superman brings both of those together. And there is this motif that each of us are the sons or daughters of our fathers and mothers, our proximal fathers and mothers, but simultaneously we are the true sons and daughters of the divine. Culture, let's say, and the spirit of culture, and nature and the spirit of nature. And so each of us, that's why when you're born lowly, let's say, you're actually not, because regardless of where you're born, you're also the child of everything, of nature and culture and of the transcendent simultaneously. And indeed Christ, I mean, born in the stable, carpenter, but the Davidic lineage. So again, you've got that
That's why the descent into Egypt is so important, isn't it?
Yes.
It's clearly sort of recapitulating that motif. Yeah.
But here, a very obvious point, all the heroes are women.
Yeah, it's so interesting that the proper heroic target of the women's heroic action is, in fact, the helpless infant, right? The compassion isn't being misplaced, because compassion, as far as I can tell, that overarching compassion is particularly appropriate when it's directed towards that which is truly helpless. But if it starts to be directed as if towards infants, to those who could be competent, then it starts to become destructive. So it's feminine compassion in the right place here. And so even if it's the Pharaoh's daughter.
The maternal virtues.
Yes, true maternal virtues, right? Which is the care of the truly helpless and perhaps the truly oppressed. Then said his sister to Pharaoh's daughter, "Shall I go and call to thee a nurse of the Hebrew women, that she may nurse the child for thee?" And the Pharaoh's daughter said to her, "Go." And the maid went and called the child's mother. It's
very sneaky of the Hebrews. And Pharaoh's daughter said unto her, take this child away, so she adopts him, and nurse it for me, and I will give thee thy wages. And the woman took the child and nursed it. And the child grew, and she brought him unto Pharaoh's daughter, and he became her son. So now he's the son of the king, the grandson of the Pharaoh. So interesting that
It's also very powerful as an adoptive father. I have two sons, one biological, one adoptive. And this has always spoken to me profoundly, that she is regarded as his mother, and she's clearly not his biological mother. Mm-hmm. In Jewish tradition, she is which is remarkable to me, because you would think blood would be dominant. But in later Jewish tradition, she is called Batya, the daughter of God, and she is regarded as Moses' mother.
Mm-hmm. Really interesting.
Very interesting.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. For those who are interested in the Greek and have a more have taken on the Greek philosophy and everything, St. Gregory of Nyssa sees the relationship between the two mothers and the relationship between his allegiance to Egypt and his allegiance to his mother as the relationship that we have with the pagan past. That is, that we are to learn and to be nurtured by our pagan ancestors and the pagan stories and the pagan philosophers, but to a degree, to a limit. Mm-hmm. And that ultimately, when you'll see later, Moses discovers or chooses his true allegiance by ultimately killing the Egyptian, but that he won't completely discount it, and
it's also the problem we all have when we're being socialized, because to some degree, to be socialized in a time and place is to fall prey to the prevailing tyranny, right? To become an avatar of that culture and the tyrannical aspects of that as well. But hopefully to simultaneously unite that with, you could say, the spirit of Israel, which is the striving towards the wrestling with God, and then to make that paramount. And so Moses' lineage is representative of the lineage of all of us. And we struggle with that, right? Because now people are ashamed of their pharaonic identity, which is the patriarchal tyranny and the capacity that has to produce the atrocities of the past. But we have to come to terms with it. And the notion that Moses kills the Pharaoh is something like the notion that, well, he overthrows or he kills the Egyptian, is that you overthrow that tyrant within, even though you necessarily owe allegiance, and then you follow something higher, something like that.
It's important to, this is quite an obvious point, but I think it's just important dwelling on the point that it's Pharaoh's daughter. This is a non-Jewish moral agent who acts in a saintly way. And I think this gives us a first taste of a theme that's going to come to dominate.
Right, that morality isn't bound by ethnicity.
That's right. This is the great gift of the Jewish people. This insight that morality is universal, is a gift to the world, is something that all human beings, as it were, are bound to. Paul later in the New Testament makes this point again in Romans 1 and chapter 1 and chapter 2 of Romans, that the Gentiles, as it were, have the law written upon their hearts. And I think this will be something that's very important when we come to look at the Ten Commandments and so on. But
yeah, so that's another echo of that notion of a transcendent good, right?
Exactly, which in the context of ancient Near Eastern religion, it's difficult to sort of exaggerate the point too much.
Right.
It really is quite extraordinary, that this idea that there is a moral code that cuts right across all tribes and all nations.
Well, it's
and all
anthropologically absurd in some sense, because the anthropological evidence suggests that we're pretty damn tribal, and that the fundamental human response, in some sense, towards people who aren't of your tribe is that they're not human.
Yeah.
So it's really an amazing vision beyond the parochial confines of, tribe and nation.
It's the first real discovery that morality is a possession that all human beings have. Mm-hmm. It's a crucial point. People often say that, the Code of Hammurabi, and that there are these sort of insights into how other peoples and other tribes are to be treated in an ethically responsible way. But I think here it really is. It's a remarkable insight. This sort of the universalism, the objectivity of moral. values.
And to Dennis's point, the elevation of the foreigner to an ethical status that supersedes the ethical status of the in-group ethnic member. Right, amazing thing. It's an amazing thing. It's very hard to account for that.
Relative to that
Divine
point,
authorship.
it's very interesting relative to that point that we were talking about the midwives who choose not to kill the children. In the case of the mother, I just think this is an amazing image. I mean, the mother can only save her son by giving him up. And not only giving him up, but actually commending him to not simply the river, but to, I mean, the anti-ethnic character of what's going on here, that somehow she must commend her own son to what you might perceive of as the enemy.
Well, that is what happens when you raise a child, though, and especially true if you raise a son, is because the son has to move beyond you into the culture. And if the culture has a tyrannically patriarchal element, which would be the Egyptian element, let's say, then in order to foster your son's development, you have to let the world take him. And that would even be the case if the broader social world has that tyrannical proclivity. And if you don't do that, you fail as a mother.
Though there's a deep sense in which the maternal instinct can only be fulfilled by transcending itself. And that's what you see here, that you can only save the son by literally giving him up.
Yeah, well, that's a sacrifice of the child motif, right? So, which is a very difficult idea to come to terms with. You see that in the Pieta, in some sense, that great Michelangelo statue, where you see Mary offering her broken son to the world, and that's what mothers do, right? That's what they have to do. I think that's equivalent to the female crucifixion in some real sense. It's like you have to allow your children, you have to offer up your children to be broken by to the world, broken by the world. Yeah, so. And it came to pass in those days, when Moses was grown, that he went out into his brethren, that be the Hebrews, and looked upon their burdens. And he spied an Egyptian smiting a Hebrew,